Thank you for joining us at Ore-atory this week. My guest is Rob Karpati. So, Rob's background, he's a leader in finance transformation and sustainable development. Rob combines over 30 years of multinational corporate finance expertise with a passion for driving social value, particularly in the artisanal mining sector. And in this episode, our goal is to explore artisanal mining, finance, dignity, and value. So, we'll be diving into all things artisanal mining and how it can reshape our approach to sustainable resource development and address some of the key challenges in our industry. So, without further ado, Rob, welcome.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you on the podcast today. I'm the mining partner at the Blended Capital Group, and my focus is obviously artisanal mining. Really, what drives me at the end of the day, ASM is a huge sector. There's 45 million or so miners worldwide. They tend to be vulnerable. They tend to lack access to capital. So commercially reasonable approaches towards formalizing them, which basically means setting up the right governance, it's about dignity of work, dignity of opportunity, human rights, making sure human rights are adhered to, and doing all that in a way that everyone wins. So cross-stakeholder value as well. Unlock ways that improve lives and economies in parallel.
And I think that that's a really important thing because in my work in the mining industry specifically, I occasionally work up with startups and juniors, but that is not the same as artisanal mining. And often, just like the mining industry from a broad standpoint, I think artisanal mining gets a poor reputation for being ones that they're putting themselves at risk, or they're hard to govern, or they're just showing up, or whatever the case may be. And I think that dispelling some of those myths and really talking about it and utilizing it and bringing it into the fold as a true form of mining that can be safe and responsible, and as you said, provide them with some dignity, I think is a really important thing for us to explore. So I'm excited to do that with you today. That all said, my big lead-off question is sort of what's getting you the most excited about your work around this at the very moment?
So the ultimate goal, dignity and human rights, along with value. But what's getting me excited specifically about what we're doing is we're creating a digital marketplace. It's going to connect investors with actual artisanal miners and democratize access to capital. So what does it mean? It means that investors are going to be able to fund formalization in a way that adds value, both financial, social, and environmental. It's going to end up improving lives and delivering at-scale formalization. So for the most part, miners today don't have access to non-predatory capital. There's bad guys with extortionate rates that they can get money from, but that's pretty much it. So the digital marketplace is going to be paradigm changing as we work on it along with our partners, the Alliance for Responsible Mining, the Capitals Coalition, and Capitals Hub Canada.
So one thing that you just mentioned that I find really, really interesting, I love that there's groups that responsible for initiative for responsible mining and other coalitions that are coming together to help formalize this process. But the access to capital, let's dig into that a little bit, because what does that really look like for artisanal miners? And I wouldn't necessarily have known that they were asking for money previously in order to do the roles that they're doing. So let's talk about how this starts.
Absolutely. So today, for the most part, artisanal miners don't have access to capital. Full stop. So it gets in the way of progress. How do you formalize? How do you set up a company or a co-op? How do you equip? How do you train? How do you improve practices? How do you make sure tunnel designs make sense? So on, without capital. Short answer is you don't. So there needs to be money to get there. So there's a bunch of different things that formalization delivers as it takes hold. It improves productivity, so there's money to be made. But more to the point, it improves the dignity of work. It improves ecological outcomes, things like biodiversity protection or reforestation or so on, it improves regional economies and can trigger sustainable development. So the idea of a digital marketplace is connecting different kind of investors so that they can work together and leverage their funding towards common goals. So notionally, the value investor, the social impact investor, the environmental investor, and so on, all contribute for their pieces, which ends up changing realities on the ground and value and impact for all the constituents.
It's a really nice concept, and I value it very much because I think that all of the things that you mentioned, the ESG component, the safety, the ability to impact local economies and people's lives, as well as keep them safe, are all critically important. And without that ability to access capital, as you said, it's not possible. But also what this does is allow us to have perhaps access to whatever these minerals or areas are that they're mining within, that are needed, without going to a big mining company and waiting forever for it to be permitted and signed off on and developed in all of those ways. Perhaps there's smaller mining scenarios where you can do that in a much more accessible fashion. So I've seen several companies crop up and that are focused on doing small mines, right? So is this specific to that, or can they become big ones? Juniors look to get taken out by big companies. How does this work and end up wind up coming into the cycle of mining from your perspective?
What a great question. And there's a continuum. So you think about it at a basic level. We need more critical minerals. We don't have enough copper, cobalt, rare earths, and so on. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why we don't have enough of it. So given what do artisanal miners do that mine critical minerals? Well, they're early indicators for exploration. So the fact that they're mining on the ground tells large mining companies, maybe I ought to go there and explore. So there's an opportunity. Another opportunity, they share land. So, joint productivity, joint risk, working together, large and small, or not working together, large and small. And the third thing in and of themselves is the value that they generate, because they produce these minerals that are in short supply. So as funding comes into place, it lowers risk across the end-to-end value chain. It lowers risk for large mining companies where land is shared. It creates value for large mining companies on shared land. It creates critical minerals downstream directly through the work of the artisanal miners themselves. And it creates paths for, as miners formalize, for them to potentially grow. So a small co-op can become a bigger co-op, and a bigger co-op can become part of a company eventually, and so on. So there's a whole bunch of mechanisms that this ends up meaning a lower risk, higher productivity value chain where everyone wins.
Well, yeah, that's exactly right. And I think I was reading on your LinkedIn profile, you use the term, it's a win-win scenario. And I often use that in my work because ideally we're creating scenarios where people want to work together and it's a win for the company, it's a win for the candidate. And in your circumstance, it's a win-win scenario because you have, as you said, you're sort of de-risking some of the mining cycle by having this artisanal mining scenario set up for success, so that they're de-risking the exploration, they're de-risking what they're doing themselves. And so it is providing a win when you've got the commodity, you've got a safe working environment that's ecologically responsible. And so I really love that. And the idea, like, we don't get very many win-wins, right? You said there's predatory lenders out there and all kinds of other things. And I just find that tends to be some of the mindset. And there's so much going on in our world that the idea to talk about something where we get a win-win and everybody winds up happy at the end is so much nicer.
Well, it's exactly the opportunity here. At the end of the day, formalization done properly starts with the voices of miners, starts with the voices of neighboring communities as well, and delivers things that make sense given their needs, values, beliefs, and fears. given their realities. It also makes sense for large mining companies. It also makes sense for downstream companies. Do you want to be sued because you're using some material that had child labor in its mining? Of course not. So when you think about win-win at a really basic level, this is an opportunity for it. And there's an imperative for it as well, not just an opportunity, because it's mining business models are under a lot of stress. And we know the industry isn't growing critical minerals the way it needs to be. We know investors aren't funding the exploration needed to deliver that. We know projects take 15, 20 years to deliver, and there's a top talent shortage. So given all of that, what are the levers? Well, we can talk about technology, fine, fair enough. But more to the point, levers around business models are levers around collaboration. And this is fundamentally around collaboration. It's doing things in a way that everyone can benefit by driving to solutions that are mutually appropriate, whether for a large miner, an artisanal, a community member, an investor, or someone down the chain.
So an area that I'm curious about, because I know very little about how this would be managed in an artisanal mining scenario, that is obviously of huge concern, right? I think that mining is under consistent scrutiny, whether they're large companies or small companies. And part of that responsibility and part of the issue that as you've mentioned, it's taking 20 plus years to create value. Sometimes it's taking 20 plus years to get into production, right? Which is prohibitive generally, as you said, for everything that we need in terms of critical minerals or other things. But how do we be mindful? How do we set up a scenario that allows artisanal miners to do this from an ESG perspective? Let's just start there. How do we train them to do this so that they are thinking with the end in mind, even though they're likely not to be responsible for that because they may get gobbled up by somebody else or this could go on beyond them? Who takes responsibility from the ESG component?
So at the end of the day, part of formalization means setting up proper governance. So whether it's a company, a co-op, or an association, and all of a sudden through that, there's a mechanism to equip, to train, to change all the practices and enable a focus on the ESG. So as that happens, it's not that we're here from Canada or the US or Europe and we're here to help. It's we're going to work with you, listen to you, develop solutions with you that make sense for you, and use responsible matrices to do that. So you think about Fairmine, you think about craft code, you think about forest smart mining standards. So the various ASM specific standards, those are end goals in the chain, because that way there's responsible artisanal mining in play. Validation, of course, goes hand in hand with that, because validation is partly about sustaining the gains. Traceability is part of that, from the miner to refiner. So you can tell the refiner and tell the downstream customer, this was responsibly made, and here's how I can prove it, given validation. So it's really an end-to-end governance and data flow environment that starts with leadership and engagement on the ground.
And the word that struck a chord with me is traceability, right? So overall that was governance, but then you talked a little bit about traceability, and I saw something recently, and I don't remember where, but it was like a nutrition label for minerals. And I thought it was a really interesting concept, because I think that often the end user is so detached from where any of this stuff comes from that having a nutrition label, so to speak, of where cobalt came from, that it's in your cell phone, or that there's all these minerals in whatever it is part of like the packaging. The traceability, I think, is going to become more and more important. And I think it's also something that we should be talking about to the marketplaces that we supply minerals to, so that they can say this is a responsibly sourced item, and this is all the stuff in it. It creates an acknowledgement that there is a mining industry or artisanal mining or however they're getting it, but it also gives them the responsibility to be influencing that as part of the supply chain. And I don't know that there's a question in there, but I'm sure you have thoughts on it.
So Ronald Cohen said an interesting thing a while ago. He said that transparency is a human right. And we haven't thought about it that way in the past, but let's say it is for a second. And traceability at the end of the day enables transparency. It helps then customers see what they're buying. If you buy a luxury watch or luxury jewelry, let's say, you want to make sure that there isn't gold mined by children in it. If you buy a cell phone, you don't want to have coltan that's a conflict mineral that led to deaths somewhere in the DRC. You want to be assured that there's a responsible environment with responsible processes and responsible practices. So from a marketing and branding point of view, and we've seen it before, Intel inside with the chips, and that gave the end manufacturers a brand advantage and Intel a whole lot of money. Well, how about responsibility inside? The ability to validate that your mineral was responsibly produced. And by being responsibly produced, ethically consistent with the person who wants responsibility in the watch they're buying or in the phone they're buying or whatever else. So there's a whole lot of power and a whole lot of alignment with broad popular expectations, given the notion of transparency, that's going to become really powerful when we look ahead, I think.
I agree with you. I think that it's becoming more and more important. And I think that we've got a youthful generation coming in with massive purchasing power and that wants to influence, probably to do good. I mean, they're still a little young, so we'll see what they come in with. But I think they're very idealistic and values driven. And so part of my challenge as a recruiter in the mining industry is always to be thinking about where the next generation is. And I cite the statistic that we've got a lot of individuals that are going to be retiring out of mining, specifically in North America, but that we need to figure out how to attract others. And I think that this idea that you and I are talking about, where it's responsibly sourced, where there is a value chain of traceability, where there's a win-win, that all of that makes it far more attractive to individuals who have never considered mining before as a potential career, whether it's artisanal or a larger scale. And I think it's important for companies to be values driven, and that is a soapbox of mine. But how do you think that this might influence others' perception of our industry, both from an investment standpoint and as one to join?
It's massive. I mean, what a great question, because the perception impact is massive, because the reality impact is massive. So take it piece by piece. If you're in high school or university and you're thinking about what program to take and what you want to do with your life, you're going to want an industry that aligns with your values, aligns with your beliefs, aligns with your philosophies. Do you necessarily even understand there's such a thing as large-scale mining and artisanal mining? Probably not. There's something called mining, and then you see pictures of horrible conditions somewhere, and where does it leave you? Well, mining's abusive to people, to communities, to the environment. Perception's reality. I'm going to choose a different career path.
Sure.
So by changing realities in artisanal mining in collaboration between ASM and LSM, it opens the door to different perception, because it opens the door to a different reality. From an investor point of view, even more so. You're hard-nosed. You're sitting somewhere with a check that you want to write, but you're worried about risks. And there's PR risks, conflict risks, legal risks, community risks, all sorts of risks that impact you. And the degree of responsibility either mitigates or exacerbates those risks. So by creating positive relationships, by shifting towards more responsible approaches, by definition, you're lowering those risks, making investors more comfortable, which will contribute to the check that people want to be writing.
Yeah, in all ways, right? But I think this also, from an investor standpoint, it lowers the barrier to actually enter as an investor too, right? And so I think often if you think, okay, critical minerals are important, but I don't have tons of money, I'm not an accredited investor, I can't just go toss hundreds of thousands of dollars at something, this allows a lower barrier to entry for you to even learn about what it takes to invest in mining. And I think that that's really cool as well. So I think that the concept of lowering the barrier to entry as an investor to mining, we won't go big mining, small mining, whatever, but just lowering the barrier to entry as a mining investor is allowed by this model more so than one that where you have to be an accredited investor or you're going through an ETF or you've got your stockbroker or somebody dealing with it for you. I think that there's some really cool opportunities for people to find a way to invest in the mining industry on this artisanal scale. Do you think that, how would that be set up? Are there small groups? What does it look like if somebody's interested in becoming one of those investors?
Well, you're exactly right. Like today, there isn't a whole lot of global access from investors into artisanal mining. The risks scare them. They don't understand that there's a value proposition that includes financial and non-financial. So for any given investor, it's challenging to enter, understand, and execute. It's game changing. Number one is transparent.
Yep.
So all of a sudden you see the opportunities there, and you see here's a whole mess of different artisanal mining projects. Here's what they're going to deliver. Here are their dynamics, their statistics, so on. Along with that, you've got the ability to leverage your own focus area. So depending if you're an impact investor, let's say you're focused on child labor, or let's say you're focused on something very different, reforestation, or if you're a value investor focused on critical minerals or on just productivity in general, they're going to be investors combined through the digital marketplace into specific opportunities where each of them can invest given their specific profiles and interests and go forward accordingly. So the barriers of entry, both around transparency and around being able to connect their own investment to their own focus area, fundamentally gets decreased.
It's really, really fascinating to me to think of it in that way, because like you said, if you're an impact investor and there's something that you're really passionate about, like you said, reforestation or ending child labor, that may give you an entry point again into mining. Perhaps that was never your intention, but all of a sudden you've become an impact investor and now you know about mining and you're influencing massive change in somewhere. And I think that, as you said, if we change the perception, it changes the reality around it. And we've got some very big, big issues to solve from a global standpoint. And I think mining addresses a lot of them, right? And I love seeing that change happen in real time. But this transparency and the ability to invest at a smaller scale is really, really cool. Another area that I think I would love to talk more about is, what does that platform really look like? How can people access it? Does it exist at present?
So platform does exist at present, but it's not public yet, and it's not configured with all the details needed for mining. It's going to be shortly. We're talking actively to investors. Investors can reach out to me and through me with their relative partners to engage in it. We can talk about what it looks like. They can engage. So what it's going to look like at the end of the day is individual projects and a whole bunch of asset classes around those projects. So an asset class can be reforestation. An asset class can be critical mineral supply. An asset class can be solar power electrification for the mine and the small community beside it, so on. There are going to be a few dozen of these. And investors will focus on the specific asset classes they choose to, given their own criteria and the relevant details of the individual project. The bottom line with all this, Lindsey, is look, we're going to need a whole lot more mining. Mining's here to stay. Some people talk about, mining's bad. No, it's not. Mining's existential. It's foundational for our world. And we're going to need a lot more copper, a lot more cobalt, a lot more lithium, and so on. And there's 45 million artisanal miners out there, many of whom make these materials, produce these minerals. And when you include their families, there's 225 million people supported by the sector. 2.5% of the world. So all of a sudden, you're talking about an investor environment that enables the productivity, enables changes in a massive number of lives while making financial sense.
That's an incredible number. Because I think generally we think of the mining industry as very small. And this is maybe a crude way of talking about it. But I had one of my team members was at the Women in Mining conference. Somebody rattled off the statistic that the entire mining industry, which does not obviously include the artisanal mining component, is like smaller than everyone employed globally at McDonald's. Weird thing to correlate. But when what you just said makes it 2% of our people out there, which rather than thinking of mining and being small, that makes mining very, very big. And that expands the ability for us to influence everybody that would be looking at mining and investing in it or becoming part of it as a service provider or somebody that's working within it. And I guess I've never really thought of it in that way.
Well, the opportunities for impact and value are simply astounding, really, when you start looking at the scale. So look, I've never heard the comparison to McDonald's. It's fascinating. I'm not totally surprised. That's thing number one. What I do know is the large-scale mining industry has 7 million people. Yep. So BHP, Rio Tinto, Barrick, and so on. It adds up to 7 million people. Yep. 6.5 times as many artisanal miners. And these artisanal miners are in over 80 countries. They're in most of Africa, they're in most of Latin America, and they're in most of Asia. Yep. So the opportunity to combine value with impact while producing the minerals that we need for our lives, our homes, our energy transition, and so on, is massive.
How, and just comparing those two ends of the spectrum and looking, as we acknowledged earlier, and in almost every conversation we have this conversation, we've got a skills gap, we've got a need for new talent in our industry, but how do you think large mining companies, whether it's a BHP or a Rio or whatever, or maybe even smaller than that, how do you think they could perhaps integrate artisanal miners to help subsidize their workforce? Or do you think that would ever be part of a consideration?
Land is shared. Artisanal miners were there first a lot of the time. They're traditional extensions of communities. They're part of the puzzle of earning social license. So what does integrating into workforce mean is a good question, but there's degrees of integration. On one level, there's basic collaboration, so helping each other instead of ignoring each other. And large mines that enable formalization of artisanal miners on shared land, well, maybe there's off-taking agreements, maybe there's reduced risk, maybe there's a whole bunch of things that make mutual business sense. Some of the functions in the mine, like engineer, like procurement, like so on, can collaborate with artisanal miners to improve their practices. Conversely, artisanal miners have been there for a long time. They've been early indicators for exploration. They can help with that process because they know the lay of the land. They're also pairs of hands that know mining. So maybe there's opportunities situationally for leveraging workforce and employment. It'll vary place by place. But the point is, if we think about it in an open-minded way, design solutions that make sense for specific places,
Yeah.
then the number of roads that lead to collaboration are endless.
Well, I work a fair amount with companies based in and or with operations in the US and Canada. And we've obviously had a lot of change in policy and permitting and all of the rest of the stuff, but we've now got to push for really reform for permitting so that it can be done in a reasonable time frame, because we don't have access to the materials that we need domestically, and therefore it compromises our security. And so artisanal mining could also be a solution for some of that. How welcome do you think that will be in the US and Canada? Because I think we've talked about it being in other places. I know that that does not preclude that it exists in either of our two communities. But what does that look like from your perspective, and how do we foster that?
So permitting rules need to have minimized bureaucracy. We know some of it exists. That's a bad thing. It needs to be removed. Even having said that, though, there's some things where pace can't change. Exploration takes as long as it takes, and the speed of trust can't be circumvented. So building trust with communities and with other stakeholders. So the 15 to 20 years to set up a copper mine, for instance, today, it can be accelerated, but really by how much?
Yeah.
Artisanal miners are there today. So they're in a lot of countries today. They're pretty much not in the US, pretty much barely in Canada, only a small handful, but they're in a lot of places. Formalization can multiply productivity quickly within months, not decades, but months, because equipment and training and governance can be transitioned to a better place in short order. So number one, there's a near-term opportunity with that. Number two, whether or not artisanal mining happens in Canada or the US, Canadian and US and Australian and European mining companies operate in Latin America, in Africa, and Asia.
Yep.
So the notion of collaborating the right way with artisanal miners to lock in that productivity, to offtake it, to bridge supply gaps, it's a clear opportunity that just makes strategic sense and geopolitical sense given gaps in supply. Are there going to be an army of artisanal miners in Canada and the US? Well, probably tough, probably not a huge number, but there might not need to be if Canadian and US companies and European and Australian dial into artisanal miners where they've got projects around the globe.
Sure. And, perhaps another opportunity lies in learning lessons from artisanal miners that have operated in their own communities safely and without significant environmental impact, and that are forward looking and see the benefits from mining, to educate some of our individuals who are responsible for going in and doing community relations and investor relations, right? And changing that dialogue and saying, hey, this is something that's been in our communities forever, and these are some of the challenges we faced, and this is how we're doing it. And it's actually been a good thing for us, right? Because often in the US and Canada, I guess specifically, it takes us a lot of time and a lot of money to go and talk to everybody and educate them and tell them about the impacts and the short and long-term ramifications of what having mining in their backyard is. And we have this idea of NIMBY happening all of the time, but maybe we should be talking to those who have had it in their backyard all along to teach us how to do that better.
Absolutely. Artisanal miners are extensions of communities. They've been there. They're people who belong to the communities. They understand the needs, the fears, the beliefs, the values. So they're a discrete stakeholder group, obviously, because they do a particular kind of work that intersects with a large project. But they're also key to the broader process of earning social license when you think about it that way. So there's a whole lot that large companies can learn from them as collaboration kicks in. And some of those needs, fears, concerns, and values, they're universal. If it's a project in Arizona, a community in Arizona will have similar fears around water, for instance, that community in Africa will have. So how's it dealt with in one place? Can we learn? Can we leverage? Absolutely.
Well, and I think part of our conversation, a word that I've heard both of us say, probably you more than I at this point, is collaborative. And I think traditionally in the mining industry, it's sort of like everybody has their own method. And while we've traded people back and forth between companies, there's not always been tons of collaborative efforts. And I think that because we're going to lack the number of people to do the roles that we have out there, that we're going to have to inherently become more collaborative as an industry to attract talent, to retain talent, to protect environmental standards, to do all the things that we have to do. And so I'm really encouraged by learning from the artisanal mining side, who inherently has to be collaborative, so that we can take some of those lessons and push it forward into our juniors, mid-tiers, and majors. But collaboration is, I think we need to polish that up in mining generally.
Absolutely. As well as I do, and everyone listening knows, mining's had an uneven history. There are some bad stories. Today, it's still uneven. There are some good stories and some companies that are very good at social engagement. There are some other companies that are, we're going to say, a lot less so. But at the end of the day, the industry itself needs to transform, because being able to deliver exponential critical minerals, get that investment, thrive in a conflict-free context, manage the geopolitics where there's competing blocks for critical minerals. Collaboration's a glue that can enable value in whole different ways. And that's what this ASM formalization work is all about. It's one example of that, not the only, but it's certainly one example of that. And the digital marketplace, when you think about leveraging different investor categories towards mutual value, right there, that's a platform that enables collaboration.
Yeah, absolutely. It's fascinating to me because I find that it's not part of the larger conversation so often, and I love learning some of these new things from you, and hopefully letting others also take part in this conversation. Before we go too far downstream, because I feel like we were probably nearing the end of our time together, how can people get in touch with you, Rob?
Okay, so number one, please get in touch with me. So if you're an investor, if you're a leader in a mining company, if you're an industry stakeholder, I want people to get in touch with me. And my partners and collaborators want people to get in touch with them. So there's a number of ways to do that. One way is LinkedIn, and you can look me up and ping me through LinkedIn with a DM. Another way is you can email me, rk@blended.capital, and reach out to me, and then we can have a conversation and we can talk about what the digital marketplace means for you. We can talk about what's going to deliver. We can talk about how you can engage, and we can hook you up with my different partners and collaborators who can dive into the various specifics that are in the mix.
Well, thank you for that. And, I suspect that you're probably going to have a lot of LinkedIn requests and emails coming up, because I think that this is a really, really interesting conversation, and hopefully allows some different people to come to the forefront and share ideas and learn a bit more from you. Is there anything that we haven't yet talked about that you'd like to chat about today?
I think it's been a fantastic conversation that I've really appreciated, Lindsey. The single point I'd like to emphasize, maybe, now's the time, today, because we're talking 45 million miners. We're talking implications for large-scale miners, downstream value chains. We're talking geopolitics and critical mineral shortages. So this isn't a conversation that's years out and theoretical. This is a conversation where we're acting, we're developing, we're going to roll out this digital marketplace now in coming months, and we're going to engage miners and investors now in coming months as we do that. So there's a time horizon here that's immediate, and that's going to accelerate as we extend the circle of projects and investors over the course of time.
Well, I'm really excited to see this come to fruition, and I welcome you back when this is up, so that we can have a conversation about how that's moving forward. Answer other people's questions that may have interest in it as we see that come out. And I thank you for all of your knowledge and sharing it with me and whomever chooses to watch or listen into our conversation today. I very much appreciate all of the time you've taken, and thank you.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you and to share the message.